to wear masks or to wear one yourself if you know you're going to be around sick people. In short, 2020 was the year of turning Japanese. This is another very obvious one because obviously every new president of the United States is destined to become a major cultural figure in American life, not just in politics, but entertainment and stuff as well. Compared to other recent presidents, however, Biden isn't all that exciting. He kind of reminds me of the old man Bush in the sense of just being an elderly career politician with no real gimmicks, unlike the last few guys. Like Bush, he also has a relatively boring face, which means that it is difficult for cartoonists to make him into a stylized symbol. I notice a lot of people are cheating by making him always wearing his famous sunglasses all the time, sort of leaning on that as the visual shorthand for how you know a character is supposed to be Biden. But at the same time, Biden also did give the world Vice President Kamala Harris, and that's a pretty big deal. As they say, you never forget your first, and American culture tends to heavily sentimentalize anyone who is able to break the so-called color barrier or glass ceiling. And as the first ever black female Asian VP, odds are pretty high that even a generation from now, Kamala Harris will still be appearing in American textbooks alongside Jackie Robinson and Mae Jemison. So this feels like it happened a million years ago, but you may recall that back in January, the basketball star Kobe Bryant died in a horrible plane crash in what is easily one of the biggest celebrity tragedies of all time.
The chopper reportedly went down just before 10 a.m. local time, according to Fire.
The tributes are pouring in for Bryant, who jumped from high school straight into the pros in 1996 and would win 5 championships as a Los Angeles Laker.
An Oscar winner and a family man.
But it's more than sports. He was a part of our culture.
Now, I don't want to sound too cold about this, but the morbid truth is that premature deaths really help solidify a celebrity's place in the American cultural canon. People like Marilyn Monroe, Tupac, and Bruce Lee weren't necessarily the best at what they did, but their premature deaths still made them more legendary than they could ever be in life. I guess this is because when people die young, they kind of get frozen in our minds as being young and perfect forever, and we never have to see them get old and lame. Now, Kobe might not be the perfect example of this because he'd already been retired from basketball for a few years at the time of his death, but he was still just 41 years old, and he died close enough to his peak of fame to, I think, make him a likely candidate to achieve the kind of tragic icon status that, thankfully, doesn't come along too often these days. So this year was probably the most influential ever for the Black Lives Matter movement. If your community is anything like mine, you have probably seen a proliferation of signs like these in the windows of downtown shops and things. And of course, there are a number of cities across the US that now have this slogan permanently painted across their streets. But the whole BLM movement was too easy to cite, so I decided to go with George Floyd instead, the man who is often credited with indirectly starting the 2020 BLM revival, because of course his death at the hands of police is said to be the spark that ignited this summer's big protest movement. A lot of people have drawn analogies between George Floyd and Emmett Till, the iconic young man whose killing in 1955 is often considered one of the major sparks of the civil rights movement. Regardless if you think that's a good analogy, the point is that social movements often need an instigating symbol to rally around. George Floyd has accordingly become a household name, and this iconic photo of him has inspired art and murals across the US. 2020 seems like it was a fairly pivotal year for racial politics, and I don't think it will ever be possible to tell that story without George. All right, on a lighter note, this is another one that feels like it's been with us for a million years, but actually only became a big thing in 2020. Now, the idea of a Karen, in the sense of a very fussy middle-class woman who's very entitled and unreasonable, especially when dealing with retail workers, it's obviously not that new of an insight. But it was not until this year that the idea that this phenomenon had a name really went mainstream. More than just a name, in fact, a face and a hairstyle. They were even selling Karen Halloween costumes this year, which is always a good sign that you've made it into the American cultural canon. The Karen phenomenon reminds me a lot of one of the great cultural legacies of 2019, okay boomer, or even this broader idea of using the term boomer as an insult. Both of these developments are significant because I think they really represent the degree that we millennials and zoomers are beginning to assert ourselves more aggressively and viciously in the whole generational pecking order. I mean, if you think about it, what even is a Karen other than a kind of updated stereotype about the appearance and behavior of an old woman? Our stereotypes of the old always tell us a lot about the values of the young. So when I was a kid, I would say there was always two very clear technological benchmarks for what the future should have. The first was flying cars, obviously. But the second was video phones. Now, unlike flying cars, you could say that we actually achieved video phone technology fairly quickly in the form of webcams and early instant messaging apps and stuff. But 2020 really feels like the turning point in which this sort of technology moved from being an occasional novelty to something people actively use as part of their day-to-day lives. Clearly, most of this has to do with the pandemic and the unprecedented degree that people are working from home now and thus need to find ways to hold staff meetings and all the rest. But it's also spiraled way beyond that, with people now having Zoom graduations and Zoom funerals and Zoom classrooms and Zoom trials and even Zoom parliaments. Now, I know that a lot of people really hate doing things this way, but deep down, I think most of us also understand that up until now, we were probably underutilizing video phone technology, and that it's actually a lot more useful than we previously realized. One other thing I wonder about is whether the brand name Zoom will eventually become synonymous with all video phone type technology. The Zoom program really seems to have come out of nowhere and crushed all of its competition overnight. So I wonder if we're maybe dealing with the next Kleenex or Jell-O here, in the sense of a copyrighted name that eventually becomes used as the generic term. Okay, so I'm aware that this is a high-risk one because, of course, when it comes to toys and games and things like that, it can be hard to separate fads from things with more legitimate sticking power. For example, if I had made a video like this in 2017, it would have been easy to declare that fidget spinners were destined to become a permanent part of American culture. And while I am personally doing my best to keep this one going, even I know that the moment is over. But I feel like the video game Among Us might be different. Now, I've never actually played the game, but according to this Among Us player's guide I bought at the drugstore, it is a global phenomenon that has surpassed 100 million downloads and is one of the most watched games on Twitch. And of course, I know that all of the big celebrities and influencers are clamoring to get on the bandwagon as well. But the big reason I think it is worth betting on is the characters. These little spaceman people have such a great combination of being very recognizable, very simple, and very versatile, which is the sort of thing that good characters tend to have. They're easy to merchandise, but they're also easy to learn to draw. And since they have no real personalities, you can put them in any situation you want, in memes or comics or restaurant window paintings or whatever. If they play their cards right, I definitely think that Inner Sloth Games could have the next Minions on their hands. So keep your eyes peeled for boomers sharing memes of them on Facebook. That's how you know they've really made it. And lastly, as my final cultural thing of 2020, I would nominate 2020 itself. That might seem like a bit of a cop-out, but 2020 has also been weird in just how much people talk about it as a year, if that makes sense. A uniquely awful year, specifically, with people selling all sorts of tacky 2020 sucks merchandise. You may have even seen this Match.com ad where they have Satan going on a date with a woman who is the physical embodiment of the year 2020.
Call me 2020.
Of course, the idea of a specific year being uniquely bad is not new. You may recall that there was a lot of similar talk about hashtag 2016 being the hashtag worst year ever. But I think that 2020's terrible reputation might be a longer lasting thing for a couple of reasons. One is just that I don't think the pandemic is likely to be forgotten anytime soon. And particularly if the pandemic phases out by 2021, which of course we all hope and pray that it will, then you will have a very clear-cut case in which a very big event was very clearly tied to one specific year, similar to like 1945 or 2001. But I also wonder if 2020 is destined to be particularly memorable just because of how it looks. You only get years where the hundreds and thousands match up perfectly with the tens and ones once every century, and a perfectly symmetrical, divisible by 10 number only comes once every millennium, and we should never underestimate how much we humans are suckers for this kind of thing. I am really getting ahead of myself now,